And when the sick were in the throes of death, they still called out piteously to their family and neighbors, "I'm still alive, don't be frightened, perhaps I won't die. Please hold me tight, hug my wasted body." At this, as everyone else kept their distance, somebody might take pity and leave a candle burning by the bedhead as he fled. And when the victim had breathed his last, it was often the mother who shrouded her son and placed him in the coffin, or the husband who did the same for his wife, for everybody else refused to touch the dead body. Before the Black Death reached Europe in 1347, Europe was experiencing significant social, economic, and environmental stress. The population had been growing rapidly, leading to overcultivation of land and soil depletion. This agricultural strain, combined with a series of famines and poor harvests in the early 14th century, left the population weakened and malnourished. Socially, Europe was structured around the feudal system, with a rigid hierarchy and limited mobility for the lower classes. The majority of people lived in rural areas as peasants under the authority of local lords. City centers were growing but were often overcrowded. The convergence of these factors created a vulnerable environment, making Europe susceptible to the catastrophic impact of the Black Death when it arrived. The Black Death originated in Central Asia. Genetic analyses suggest that the bacterium responsible for the plague evolved in the region around the Tian Shan Mountains, bordering modern-day Kyrgyzstan and China. The plague began to spread westward in the 1330s, likely carried by the Mongol Empire's extensive trade networks and military campaigns. The plague is believed to have first entered Europe during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, Crimea, in 1347. The besieging Mongol army, heavily suffering from the plague, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. When the Genoese sailors fled the city, they brought the disease with them, inadvertently spreading it throughout Europe. Just a quick reminder, if you are enjoying the content so far, click the subscribe button right now so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Gabriele de Musis, a notary from Piacenza in Italy, wrote about the origin of the plague in 1348. "In the name of God, Amen." Here begins an account of the disease or mortality which occurred in 1348, put together by Gabriele de Musis of Piacenza. The dying Tatars, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, and realizing that they had no hope of escape, lost interest in the siege. But they ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could in the sea. And soon, the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply, and the stench was so overwhelming that hardly one in several thousand was in a position to flee the remains of the Tatar army. Moreover, one infected man could carry the poison to others and infect people and places with the disease by look alone. No one knew, or could discover, a means of defense. The plague spread rapidly. The primary cause was the rat flea, which infested black rats commonly found aboard merchant ships. As these ships traveled across the Mediterranean and beyond, the fleas and infected rats spread the plague to major ports such as Constantinople, Sicily, and Genoa. From these entry points, the disease quickly moved inland via established trade routes and overland caravans. When an infected rat eventually died, the flea, desperate for a new blood source, would begin its search for another host. In the absence of available rats, these fleas would turn to the nearest available alternative, often humans, transmitting the deadly bacteria responsible for the plague. Its transmission was exacerbated by the densely populated conditions of medieval cities. Bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Once infected, the bacteria travel through the lymphatic system, heading for the nearest lymph node, where they begin to multiply rapidly. The onset of bubonic plague is abrupt. Within 2 to 6 days of exposure, the infected person is struck with a sudden high fever, often accompanied by chills and intense headaches. Muscle aches and overall weakness quickly follow. However, the most telltale sign of bubonic plague is the appearance of buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes that can grow to the size of an apple or an orange. These buboes typically develop in the groin, armpit, or neck, depending on where the flea bite occurred. If left untreated, the infection can escalate dramatically. The bacteria can spread from the lymph nodes to the bloodstream, leading to septicemic plague. This stage of the disease is marked by severe abdominal pain, shock, and bleeding into the skin and other organs. The skin may turn black and die, particularly on the fingers, toes, and nose, a condition known as gangrene. In some cases, the infection can further spread to the lungs, resulting in pneumonic plague. This form is highly contagious, as it can be transmitted through respiratory droplets when an infected person coughs. Symptoms include severe respiratory distress, chest pain, and coughing up blood. Pneumonic plague progresses rapidly and can be fatal within 24 hours if not treated immediately. It had a catastrophic and immediate impact on the population. This drastic population decline led to the abandonment of entire villages and severe depopulation in cities. The cities were littered with the dead, and the overwhelming number of bodies often led to mass graves and unceremonious burials. The plague killed entire communities almost overnight. Streets once filled with life quickly filled with death, abandoned buildings and the stench of decay. Villages that once teemed with life became ghostly remnants of their former selves. Entire families died, leaving homes and farms deserted. Fields went untended, crops rotted where they stood, and the once vibrant countryside turned into a patchwork of abandoned, overgrown plots. The death toll was so high that traditional burial practices became impossible to maintain. Churches and graveyards overflowed with corpses, leaving no space for individual graves. The sheer volume of the dead necessitated mass graves. These pits, hastily dug in the outskirts of towns or in churchyards, became the final resting place for many. Bodies, often wrapped in simple shrouds or left in the clothes they died in, were piled high in these communal graves. Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer, depicted the reality of mass graves during the plague. Quote, "Such was the multitude of corpses, of which further consignments were arriving every day and almost by the hour at each of the churches, that there was not sufficient consecrated ground for them to be buried in, especially if each was to have its own plot in accordance with long-established custom. So when all the graves were full, huge trenches were excavated in the churchyards, into which new arrivals were placed in their hundreds, stowed tier upon tier like ship's cargo, each layer of corpses being covered over with a thin layer of soil till the trench was filled to the top." The dramatic reduction in population had profound effects on the social structure of medieval Europe. The sudden and massive loss of life also caused a significant decline in agricultural production, as there were simply not enough people to work the fields. With a significant decrease in the workforce, surviving laborers found themselves in high demand. This labor shortage enabled workers to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The traditional feudal system, which tied peasants to the land and their lords, began to erode. Many peasants took advantage of the labor shortage to move to different areas in search of better opportunities. In a chronicle from the Cathedral Priory in Rochester from 1350, someone has written, quote, "A great mortality destroyed more than a third of the men, women, and children. As a result, there was such a shortage of servants, craftsmen, and workmen, and of agricultural workers and laborers, that a great many lords and people, although well endowed with goods and possessions, were yet without service and attendance. Alas, this mortality devoured such a multitude of both sexes that no one could be found to carry the bodies of the dead to burial, but men and women carried the bodies of their own little ones to church on their shoulders and threw them into mass graves, from which arose such a stink that it was barely possible for anyone to go past a churchyard." The Black Death left a lasting mark on the cultural landscape of Europe. Art and literature from the period reflect the pervasive sense of despair and the macabre fascination with death. The theme of memento mori, reminding people of their mortality, became prevalent. Works such as Boccaccio's Decameron depict the horror and social chaos of the time. Additionally, the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became a common artistic motif during the period of the Black Death. This theme became widespread in various forms of art, including paintings, carvings, and frescoes. It vividly depicted a procession or dance where figures from all walks of life, from peasants to monarchs, joined hands with the personification of death. This scene served as a reminder of death's universality and inevitability, cutting across all boundaries, a reflection on mortality and the transient nature of life. Religiously, the plague led to a crisis of faith for many. The inability of the church to protect the population or explain the calamity led to widespread disenchantment. This disillusionment was reflected in the rise of the flagellant movement, where groups would publicly whip themselves in penance, believing the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Robert of Avesbury, an English historian living at the time, gives an eyewitness account of the flagellants. Quote, "In that same year of 1349, about Michaelmas, 29th of September, more than 120 men, for the most part from Zealand or Holland, arrived in London from Flanders. These went barefoot in procession twice a day in the sight of the people, sometimes in St. Paul's Church, and sometimes elsewhere in the city, their bodies naked except for a linen cloth from loins to ankle. Each wore a hood painted with a red cross at front and back, and carried in his right hand a whip with 3 thongs. Each thong had a knot in it, with something sharp, like a needle, stuck through the middle of the knot so that it stuck out on each side, and as they walked one after the other, they struck themselves with these whips on their naked, bloody bodies, 4 of them singing in their own tongue, and the rest answering in the manner of the Christian litany. 3 times in each procession, they would all prostrate themselves on the ground, with their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross. Still singing, and beginning with the man at the end, each in turn would step over the others, lashing the man beneath him once with his whip, until all of those lying down had gone through the same ritual. Then each one put on his usual clothes, and, always with their hoods on their heads and carrying their whips, they departed to their lodgings. It was said that they performed a similar penance every night." The Black Death also intensified persecution, particularly against Jewish communities, who were scapegoated and accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. This led to violent pogroms and the massacre of thousands of Jews. Medieval medical practices and religious beliefs heavily influenced how people responded to the plague. Lacking an understanding of the disease's true cause, treatments were a mix of superstition, rudimentary science, and desperate measures. Some believed that earthquakes had released fumes containing the plague, while others pointed to astrological causes as the origin of the epidemic. Medically, physicians relied on theories inherited from ancient Greek and Roman texts, which emphasized the need to balance the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To combat what they perceived as a disease of imbalance, treatments could range from bloodletting to prescribing specific diets. Additionally, fumigation with incense or herbs was a common practice, used in an attempt to purify what was thought to be air contaminated with miasmas or harmful vapors. These efforts reflect the blend of scientific and mystical thinking characteristic of the era, showing a medical community striving to find solutions with the limited knowledge available to them. Many other reasons for the outbreak were given as the cause, like indecent clothing. English Franciscan theologian John of Reading wrote, quote, "And no wonder, given the empty-headedness of the English, who remained wedded to a crazy range of outlandish clothing without realizing the evil which would come of it. They began to wear useless little hoods, laced and buttoned so tightly at the throat that they only covered the shoulders, and which had tippets like cords. In addition, they wore paltocks, extremely short garments, some of wool, and others padded and quilted, which failed to conceal their arses or their private parts. They also wore very long-legged hose called harlots, gadlingers or laurels, tied to these short garments with laces. Also shoes with long toes and long knives hanging between their thighs, and caps of cloth twisted back into the shape of hose or sleeves. These misshapen and tight clothes did not allow them to kneel to God or to the saints, to their lords or to each other, to serve or do reverence without great discomfort, and were also highly dangerous in battle. Infected by malice, cunning, deceit, and evil, perverting every convention, decency, and standard in their deeds, gestures, and words, men considered that to deflower virgins and violate the chastity of wives and widows was doing them a favor, not an injury. Men did not have sexual intercourse with their wives, or married women with their husbands, but preferred to get bastards on strangers. In conclusion, the Black Death radically transformed European society in ways that were both immediate and lasting. The plague's massive death toll disrupted the existing social and economic structures, leading to significant changes. The demographic collapse also had profound cultural impacts. Art and literature took on darker tones, reflecting the presence of death and existential uncertainty that pervaded the society. If you liked this episode, be sure to watch our video on the 1495 syphilis outbreak in Europe. Thanks for tuning in to this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to see more of our videos. Thanks for watching.